Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, the second part of our modern horror unit, looking at David Sodergren's recent novel, The Haar. Last week, we talked about the tensions between the domestic and the strange, and we talked about the very real focus on bodies, on the flesh, presented in all of its complexity and all of its vulnerability and all of its grossness, juxtaposed with this mechanical ideal of the capitalist machine. The flesh here, the body here, used as a starting point for every interaction so that we can study the ways in which bodies exist and represent themselves, but also in combination represent more than that. And, of course, in that existence, in that movement, in that combination, generate a kind of authenticity, a kind of identity. I had a really good time discussing this book last week, and I think that this week's discussion is going to be just as strong because this novel really does, I think, pick up, for all that I described it last week as being somewhat straightforward, a straightforward proposition. I talked at length about the kind of promise that horror writers have to make the reader as you move into their text so that you can be outraged and shocked and appalled by the things that you are supposed to be outraged, shocked, and appalled by, so that you can put your attention in the right places and thus yield the proper narrative reward from the story. For all of that, I've really felt this week that Sodergren's novel does twist in interesting and unexpected ways. Not completely unexpected, perhaps. I still think that if you sat down and read the first couple of chapters of the book, or at least if you got up to the first slide of tonight's reading where we meet the creature, we find the creature on the beach, then you'd have a pretty solid chance of being able to sketch the end of the book too, right? These things do kind of flow the one into the other, from first to last. But there are some interesting nuances, and there are some interesting complications in terms of Sodergren's approach to genre. I've been thinking this week about how this book obviously exists as a somewhat splashy, somewhat gory, somewhat thematically ambitious kind of modern horror novel. That was, after all, why we chose this text for our modern horror unit. But it also has all of these other qualities kind of vying for position within it. There is this clean, kind of somewhat elemental, kind of somewhat melodramatic strand of YA sentimentality, sentimentalism, I suppose, right there at the heart of the book. There is also all of this pulp inflection. There's a lot of, kind of dime paperback kind of a kind of mechanistic, pugilistic viscerality to some of the parts in particular that we're going to discuss in this week's reading. And there's also an inescapable sense of the cozy. And I'm not sure that I've ever been able to kind of identify a cozy horror novel before. But if this isn't it, then I don't know what is. Do you know what I mean? In terms of, taking horror here to mean this kind of very splashy, very exploitative, very kind of viscerally connected and gory kind of book. I find it so fascinating how Sodergren manages to hybridize all of these different genres by apparently paying no attention to any kind of effort to hybridize them, by just slamming them into each other, which is refreshing. It leaves a great kind of constant kind of effervescence on the tongue as one is reading this book. I think there's a real kind of constantly changing, constantly shifting, kind of Avalonian aspect to this book, even as you're moving through it. You're never quite sure what is to come next. And sometimes it defies you in ways which I think are somewhat downplayed. Sometimes we'll talk about it. There's a particular point that we're getting to in terms of tonight's reading that I really want to call out, because I would put money on there being a revision right here in the book. Elizabeth is asking here, why the association with sentimentalism and YA? I was thinking romance. Certainly romance, for sure, right? But there are qualities to that romance that are very, very melodramatic, right? The idea of melodrama as a communicative form wherein every thought is expressed, where everything is right on the outside of the body, which is, of course, completely appropriate to a text that is so preoccupied with the body, yes, but also with appearances, with seemings and with beings throughout the book. I think it's appropriate that it play this kind of game of manifesting directly the internal personality in the external appearance, right? And that's true, of course, for the big feelings that we have that we're going to start to approach in this week's reading, but also for the way in which the villains are drawn, right? I was talking a little last week about both Patrick and Connor Grant being drawn as very kind of heavy-handed, almost soap opera villains, which, not to say that that's inappropriate for the kinds of people that we are satirizing in this book with those characters in particular. But it does feel perhaps a little more operatic, a little more melodramatic. And thus, when I think of melodrama, when I think about these big emotions all being expressed like very directly, these kinds of lifetime commitments and kind of eternal loves, I'm thinking, of course, about, the YA kind of sentimentality. Except I would kind of distance those two things, right? That is YA sentimentality, but there is also, anchored in the body of Muriel Margaret Macaulay, this lovely kind of, this lovely, rich, mature sentimentality, right? Without any kind of without any shame put on that word at all, right? With no slight intended. Muriel Margaret is a sentimental figure. She is at the end of her life, right? Arthur is a sentimental figure. The other kind of last holdouts, the other Rebel Alliance here are all sentimental figures. There is a connection here to another kind of melodramatic, but this time gothically inflected melodrama here, with the idea of a vanished world, with the idea of the past constantly intruding upon the present. And I've just named like 6 different, genre conceits that Sodergren is lumping together here, is mashing together here, is really kind of mixing, which is just a lovely thing. Hugh is asking here in the chat, in some ways the horror elements are understated. There's a search for answers. What is the creature really? Is the creature a surrogate for her husband? Or is the creature just reading her desires and manifesting those desires? And can the creature control it? No rush for answers on my part, says Hugh, which is good, because a couple of those questions we can't really answer until we get to the final movement of the story next week. Let's explore this week then how the creature presents itself, how Muriel relates to it, and how we understand, as I say, these interesting intersections of physicality and identity, because we're going to be spending a lot of time with that. Obviously we're going to be talking about Avalon, we're going to be talking about Billy, we're going to be talking the intersection of those two things, right? The degree to which Avalon in the guise of Billy is indistinguishable from Billy, not intellectually, but emotionally for Muriel. I think there's, as I say, qualities of seeming and qualities of being, and the intersection between those two things. The body is what's true, which is, in its own way, like quietly very radical. I will say that I think that the fusion of genre here, also very radical. This is the kind of thing you can get away with when you are an independently published author. But this idea of prioritizing the body in terms of the human experience kind of stands at odds to gestures at all of Western civilization, gestures at 2,000 years of history here, right? Because this idea of dualism has been, on the minds of the great philosophers of the world, from pre-Platonic philosophers all the way through Descartes up to the modern era. Philosophers have wrestled with this disassociation and association between the body and the mind, or the soul, or the spirit, or whatever ineffable spark there is inside of you that is really secretly you, and this body that you walk around in, right? These are the two parts of you. How do we understand them to be unified? How do we understand them to be distinguished from one another? Are we just minds, really? Like, is the mind, the soul, the spirit the important thing? Or are we really just bodies? Or do we find some middle ground? Are we minds with bodies, or are we bodies with minds? The answer is never really completely fixed. Different philosophers have taken different approaches, and where we are in terms of a common consensus, the popular culture, if you like, swings. It moves back and forth like a pendulum. But and horror, I should say specifically, has done a lot of work, has done a lot of heavy lifting over the years to kind of resituate our experience of being human in the meat of our bodies, rather than abstracting it out, right? When we think of horror as a visceral genre, as a genre that causes a physical reaction in us, that's one of the things that it can do, is force us to contend with the fact that we are ourselves flesh and blood. But in general, I'm going to say that our modern world, particularly our, Western European, Anglo-American, Anglophonic modern world, prioritizes the mind. We are who we are up here, and the rest of us, is a thing that can be altered. It is subordinated. It is objectified. It is all too frequently commodified. It is machinery which we operate. And what Sodergren is doing here by putting the stress on bodies, particularly in the form of Avalon, right? The nebulous, ambiguous form of Avalon, and the aging form of Muriel herself, which is a very different perspective on the human body than we get in almost any kind of novel. What Sodergren is doing is forcing us to confront this sense of ourselves that lies not in our soul or our spirit or our mind or our imagination, our thoughts, our personalities, but in the body itself. And I want to continue looking at that and its quiet radicalism as we move through. And at the same time, of course, what we do in this week's reading, as contrasted with the first week's, is begin to stitch together that sense of the human experience being rooted in the body with the idea that the human experience is rooted in memory, right? We're going to be doing a lot with the evocation of memory and the superimposition of memory onto the current world around us, onto immediate experience, and try to determine the ways in which that is advantageous, the ways in which that is desirable, and the ways in which that is potentially ruinous. I did want to make a note, and I have to do this right up front because otherwise I will forget, as I forgot last week. The title of this week's session, Bright Sea, is of course in honor of Muriel herself, because I had a whole note written out for this and neglected to mention it last week. Muriel is, I think, an unusually beautiful name. It is derived from a Celtic name meaning bright sea. It's one of the very few Celtic names that kind of gained some popularity in the entirety of the British Isles and then stuck around for a little while after the Norman conquest. Most Celtic names fell out of favor, fell out of fashion, fell out of the language, honestly, at that point. But Muriel kind of stuck around and then had this slow fade all the way through, the second millennium BCE, the second millennium CE, excuse me, all the way through to the 19th century, where it is repopularized. It's re-energized by Dinah Craik's novel John Halifax Gentleman, in which it is the name of the protagonist's daughter, and that really sparks this new fondness, this new appreciation for the name Muriel. It becomes a very popular name. It becomes a very fashionable name. It grows in popularity until the 1920s, which is when it peaks. And then it kind of disappears again. It slowly fades out again. It is still very common in Scotland, and there are variants, of course, all around the world. Meryl Streep is really Muriel Streep. That's not like her actual name, but that is the derivation. And they all mean this wonderfully evocative bright sea. And of course, Margaret, Muriel's second name, I do like referring to her as Muriel Margaret. Just in my brain, it feels kind of respectful. Mrs. Macaulay doesn't quite feel right, but Muriel Margaret has more of an air to it. Margaret, of course, is derived from the Greek word for pearl. So in both instances, we're associating Muriel there with the sea. So I've spent 10 minutes talking about all of this, and we haven't even got to a single slide yet. Let's get into our discussion this evening and talk about the discovery of the creature right there on the beach. Let me call up this first slide. Oh, this is not, in fact, the first slide. I had, let me come back to my camera so that I can edit this because I need to go back. There we are. An accidental click will do it sometimes. An accidental click will just take me all to the wrong place. And unfortunately, the software is not particularly adept at rewinding. So let's try this. Okay, here we go. And of course, if you're listening to the podcast after the fact, you can click on the link in the show notes to get access to the slide packet so you can follow along. My goodness, she said. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a strange amorphous blob that pulsated like a beating heart. At first she could have sworn the membranous skin was purple, but it quickly changed to the deepest cerulean blue, then to a green as vibrant as the early leaves of spring. Despite the protestations in her bones, she knelt to take a closer look. "What are you?" The creature lay still, draped over the rocks like a wet blanket. Muriel pointed one gnarled finger and went to prod the creature. Its eye opened. She gasped as the eyeball seemed to bubble to the surface, a gelatinous, milky oval with a black pupil in the middle. It looked towards her. She withdrew her hand and a reedy tentacle formed from the creature's blob-like body. It lashed out and wrapped around her finger. Muriel stared at the slimy goop attached to her, then at the wide eye of the creature. The eye sank back into the jellied flesh until only a sliver of white remained, but it would not let go. Muriel's entire arm was numb. No, numb wasn't the word. She felt something, though she wasn't sure quite what. She closed her eyes as waves of calming pleasure pulsed from her finger. Her heart slowed, the rhythmic pounding gradually decreasing. A soft moan escaped her lips as the pain in her ribs melted away. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't, like waking from a dream. The warm sensation traveled further through her body, the dull ache in her leg washed away by the curious pulses. Here then is our creature, presented at first, of course, in this very inhuman way, in a way that isn't just inhuman, right? A fish would be inhuman, right? So some kind of weird sea creature would be inhuman. But here we're kind of rejecting the basic precepts of human physiology, of human biology. The idea that it doesn't really have a shape, that it doesn't have a color, that it doesn't have identifiable characteristics makes it alien. Although alien in an identifiable way, right? We're familiar with the notion of the jellyfish. We're familiar with the notion of these membranous creatures that live in the deep. And this is tying into that idea of the alien sea, right? The idea that the ocean is just this vast blackness filled with monsters, which, spoilers for real life, it absolutely is. But we're leveraging all of those ideas here with something that's very immediate and something that's very physical and something that is immediately tangible. For all that its body does not have a fixed form, for all that Muriel cannot interact with it directly in a way that would be recognizable one human to another or even one animal to another, there is still this immediate, literally sensual connection, right? It's not a mistake, I think, that we get this quasi-sexual response from Muriel at this first contact. The reedy tentacle formed from the creature's blob-like body, it lashed out and wrapped around her finger, right? These are alien provocative acts, the formation of this appendage, the speed with which it strikes her, the sliminess of it, of course, but then this sensation. Again, Muriel's entire being anchored in a body that is being responded to, that is being interacted with this alien form. Her entire arm is numb. Numb isn't the word. She's revising like her sense impression as it arrives to her. She closed her eyes as waves of calming pleasure pulsed from her finger. Her heart slowed, the rhythmic pounding gradually decreasing. A soft moan escaped her lips as the pain in her ribs melted away. And that's it. The prioritization of the body, of physical experience over, metaphorically here, right? Waking from a dream. The idea that the body is more real and more present than the imaginary, than the mind itself. So that is our introduction to our creature. We collect it up in a wheelbarrow. We take it all the way back home. We set it up in its new house in the bathtub. We get this moment where Muriel contemplates calling Arthur, but then remembers that he is in jail. And the next day, she goes in to see her house guest and finds him much recovered. Let's get to the introduction of Avalon as a full character then, I guess. Avalon, she suddenly said, clapping her hands together in delight. How about that? After Frankie Avalon. She grinned. Oh, of course, you wouldn't know who that is. The creature lay motionless. She knew he was listening to her. Frankie Avalon was a singer back in my day. He had such a lovely voice. Must have been in my 20s when I first heard his song Venus on the wireless. I had such a crush on him. She leaned against the bath, and let her hand linger in the cool water, remembering going to the pictures to see Frankie Avalon in his film Beach Party, sitting strumming a guitar, surrounded by impossibly good-looking young women in bikinis. It had felt like a different planet to her own life in Scotland. The creature detached itself from the side of the tub and moved silently towards her. It wrapped itself around her hand. Avalon. Yes, Avalon. Such a pretty name. So let's talk about Frankie Avalon. Let's talk about how insane the music industry was in the old days. Francis Thomas Avalon was born in 1940. He is a child actor on TV from the age of 12. He puts out 2 singles featuring his trumpet playing by the age of 14. He appears in his first movie by the age of 17, and then at 19 begins his career as a singer with an eponymous debut album that is a gigantic hit. Between 1959 and in 1962, to emphasize 4 short years, he releases 9 full albums and 31 singles. Venus is the only song that tops the Billboard Top 100, but Frankie Avalon is like everywhere for those 4 years before he slows down dramatically. In the rest of his career, he recorded only 5 more albums and released 10 more singles. So fully 2/3 of his entire career is in those first 4 years, and that is his meteoric period. He is, as of today, a hale and hearty 85 years old and is still together with Catherine Diebel, the woman that he married in 1963. He is also on Cameo, if you feel inclined to spend $250 on a personal message for yourself or a loved one. But, Frankie Avalon aside, and it's no coincidence, I suppose, that in this moment, kind of not numbed, but softened. Given this, morphine hit from her new friend, Muriel is dreamy. She's grinning. She's clapping. She's so happy. She's excited. And then she's in this reverie about, this crush, this first horny sexualized association that she experiences. Frankie Avalon was a singer back in my day. He has such a lovely voice. Maya had such a crush on him. She's remembering the immediacy of this parasocial connection for sure, right? It felt like a different planet to her own life in Scotland. There's something romantic. There's something tormented in that. There's something sad, honestly, frankly, in that. But there's something also very sensual, something very immediate. And it's confirmed by the touching of the creature around her hand once more and the acceptance of the name. But if we're, you are listening to a genre fiction podcast, and I, for my sins, am making a genre fiction podcast. So I'm going to guess. I'm going to go out on a limb and hypothesize that Frankie Avalon is not the most important association that any of us have with the word Avalon, particularly in a book that has a prominent character named Arthur. First referenced in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae in 1136. Avalon is the magical place in Arthurian myth where King Arthur's sword Excalibur is forged and where Arthur himself is taken after his final battle at Cumlan. Ruled by Arthur's sister Morgan Le Fay, it is intimately, powerfully, magically connected to the realm of fairy. The etymology of Avalon is unclear, though it is now generally thought to be. I remember even studying this maybe 2 decades ago and finding a great deal more debate in this space. But it seems now that the consensus has absolutely settled on Avalon being derived from the Welsh word affel, meaning apple. So affel, Avalon, Avalon. That's how we get there. And as I say, it's been historically and I want something stronger than speculatively. I want something, it has been new agely, it has been crystally, it has been meditatively and conspiratorially associated with Glastonbury Tor, a hill in Somerset that rises out of the marshes and was previously an island before the sea level there fell. The significance of Avalon as a fairy realm, right, to which Arthur retires to either die or be healed from his wounds, either way, with the promise of someday returning, is obviously very thematically loaded for this book too. And I guess to avoid spoilers and how this plays out right at the end of the book, we'll maybe circle back to this at the beginning of next week's reading. Or the end of next week's reading, I suppose, would be even more appropriate. So from there, we get the cute comedic scene where Arthur comes to visit and Muriel does a terrible job of pretending that everything is normal. Again, kind of engaging us in this supernatural coziness. We've got this supernatural drama that's unfolding that, were it not punctuated by these acts of almost sublime violence, right? A violence that literally transcends physicality as we understand it. I haven't pulled from those because, frankly, reading them would not be the most fun that I could have in my evening, and I'm sure that hearing me read them would not be the most fun that you could have in your morning commute or whatever. But the violence that we get, particularly the killing of Tommy, I kind of stumbled there into the word sublime, and I think that that's what I'm going to stick with. It is so excessive as to be beyond the bounds of anything that we can really connect with our real life experience, I would dare say. The idea of being literally kind of suffering this auto disemboweling that Tommy experiences, the breadth of the abuse of human flesh and human being, right, in the sense of our corporeality, is just so heightened. But were it not for that, if we could strip all of that out, this would fit very nicely in a little cozy tea time mystery. It is not hard to take the Haar and turn it into something that could go out on like British commercial television at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, right? Something that is very warm, something that probably has like Sarah Lancashire in it, right? You could easily imagine this being a very mid-budget ITV or Channel 4 production, just denuded of its violence, and kind of replacing that violence with something else that fulfills the same metaphorical pattern, right? Were it not for the need for this to be a horror novel, not to suggest that that is a bad choice or anything, but there is something there about the structure of the story existing independent of the violence and the horror elements, which makes the violence and the horror elements all the more transgressive. It's a really nice juxtaposition. It's kind of I don't know. I need to think more about this. And if you guys have thoughts on it, please do get in touch. I'll include any relevant emails or correspondence that I get in next week's show. But I've been struck again and again as I've been reading this book by the specter of Quentin Tarantino, right? I keep kind of feeling this like early mid-90s Tarantinoism kind of leaching through this book, not in any way that is directly manifest. There's nothing that I can point to and say, yeah, see that exactly right there. Tarantino would absolutely have done that. But there is something there in the sense of being exploitative, right? In the sense of exploitation cinema. There's something there to this book too. So I'm going to continue to think about that. Maybe I will have a closing thought on that next week. Okay. So we have this cute comedic scene, which I really enjoyed. And as I say, it could be played entirely for a comedy where there's a slightly different book. And then we'll cut ahead to chapter 9 and we'll get to Arthur, to our first main relocation of our POV here, away from Muriel into someone else's head. Sometimes, on the dark and lonely nights, he wondered why he still bothered. He was 88. What did he have to look forward to? His life was behind him. He was a relic of a bygone age. They all were. Now he faced a cruel and indifferent world where relics were consigned to the rubbish bin rather than placed in museums. It was a young person's world, and he and Muriel and the rest of the inhabitants of Witch Haven only lived in it. He was depressing himself, but like most men his age, he enjoyed wallowing in depression every now and again. He switched the TV off and sat in silence, lit only by the eerie glow of his cigarette. It was nice to be home. One night in jail was more than enough for him. It was Patrick Grant who deserved to be behind bars, and Arthur resolved there and then to ensure that was precisely where Grant ended up. I'll give him one thing, he said solemnly. The bastard's given me a reason to live. The cigarette burned itself down to his fingers and he flinched, dropping it into his lap. He placed the butt into the ashtray and brushed the remaining ash onto the floor. Muriel had warned him about smoking while sitting in his chair. She said he was going to fall asleep and burn the house down one day. And damn it if the woman wasn't usually right. I mentioned last week this sawtooth pattern that we get throughout the book as Sodergren will introduce a setup or a conceit or a concept and let it play out in a very minor way, only to return to it immediately with much more force, turning it from a 3 to an absolute 11, really, pegging the limit there at the top of the scale. And this is a perfect example of that, right? We get the foreshadowing here of Muriel predicting that Arthur's house will burn down and that he will be consumed by fire. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. I'm going to, as I say, skip over the sequence in which Arthur is attacked, though I will pause to note, because I'm fearful here, I think, of damning with faint praise David Sodergren's work. There are aesthetic considerations that you can fold into any kind of critical response. And there are people who are both experienced and skilled in their ability to analyze the aesthetics of horror, the aesthetics particularly of violence and gore. And as I'm sure is obvious by now, I am not that guy. It's not that I don't appreciate it. It's not that I can't, enjoy a splashy slasher flick or something similar, but I just don't have the grounding to talk with real authority, to draw from a close reading of this text and comparison with equivalent texts about Sodergren's skill at the depiction of visceral action. I can only offer my own personal response, which is that it is effective, that it is unsettlingly shocking, particularly in this week's reading, and not just the violence, but the malevolence, the impish, infernal, demonic aspect of the boys, paid for by Grant, of course. And I should repeat what I guess I'm required to say are allegations of Donald Trump during the Trump Organization's campaign in Balmidi to purchase the land necessary for the development of their golf course. There are allegations that the organization hired local youths and paid off the local Grampian police in and around Balmidi in Aberdeenshire, just as Patrick Grant does in the book. To the best of my knowledge, the allegations around the Trump Organization extend no further than intimidation and harassment. Obviously, what we get here is something much more vicious, something much more grotesque, something much more transgressive. The idea of Arthur being attacked in his own home is a different kind of violence that is modulated with the very physical violence that we see. We have the sequence with Muriel going to Arthur's home and the encounter with the police there, the return home. And this is where I found myself wondering if in an earlier version of the book, things had played out rather differently, because it is odd that we transition out to Arthur's POV in that moment. The scene as written really gives us a lovely kind of voyeuristic sense of Muriel's response to hearing the crisis at Arthur's house. There's an enormous amount of drama to be generated there from the distancing effect of Muriel's POV. But because we've been in Arthur's POV, and we've seen the entire scene play out, it robs a certain something from Muriel in that moment. And I wonder, this is my speculation, I have absolutely no information on this. No one has yet compiled a comprehensive 12-volume history of the Haar, the way that Christopher Tolkien did for the Middle-earth story. So unfortunately, I'm just going by speculation here. But it seems to me possible that in an earlier revision of the story, it wasn't Tommy who went to Muriel's house and was consumed by Avalon, but it was in fact Arthur himself. And my reasoning there is twofold. The first is the dramatic irony that would be leveraged by being in Arthur's POV during the assault and then finding the unfolding scene at Muriel's. It would just be so dark. It would be so grim. The other incidental biographical detail there that really plays for me is the revelation of Arthur's long-held feelings for Muriel, which would, upon his absorption by Avalon, I think really gives some extra weight to the romantic relationship between the two. There would be interesting areas of speculation would open up regarding Avalon's feelings for Muriel, if indeed Avalon has feelings for Muriel, the degree to which they are real, the degree to which they have been kind of subsumed from the memories of Arthur. I think there's some really interesting stuff there, and the pacing that we get here doesn't quite work. Though, as I say, each individual scene, Arthur's confrontation with the boys, the louts, then cutting out to Muriel, then getting Tommy's POV. All of that, I think, is quite effective, but it does seem as though something here isn't quite aligned properly. And I think that, it would be really tempting to be in the POV of Arthur for something much more grim, something much more bleakly ironic with Avalon here. We will switch again. We switch into Tommy's POV for his experience with Avalon, as I said, that incredibly graphic and violent scene. And we're going to continue that pattern. We're going to switch again into the POVs of the victims, if victims is the right word, the meals of Avalon through other sequences in the book. So we'll even cover one of those today. Here we are. We skip ahead to Muriel returning to her cottage, seeing the light on, seeing the blood everywhere, and then we get the arrival of Billy. Let me call up the slide here. Oh, it's happened again. No, we're here. We got the right slide. I need to title these slides a little more effectively in my notes so that I can completely remember which slide it is that I've pulled. I have just titled this one Billy, and I thought that I had pulled his initial introduction, but in the interests of brevity, I have pushed a little further on than that. This is the scene where they talk. He nodded. I am the one you call Avalon. He spoke falteringly, like each new word was an effort. Muriel knew she shouldn't feel so relaxed. What she was witnessing, what she was hearing was impossible. You've finally gone doolally. Avalon, she said, ignoring the voice in her head. What have you done? I made the pain go away. She stared at him for a long time. Then she reached her hand out and touched his arm. It was cold and damp. How? She said. Avalon tilted his head as if trying to understand. As he did, Muriel studied his face for imperfections, for a flaw in the illusion. She found none. It was Billy, perfectly recreated. Well, not quite. He was considerably younger than when he had died. His hair was no longer white. Instead, it was dark and streaked with grey. The lines around his eyes were less pronounced, his chin firmer, stronger. You look exactly like him. I found him in your memories, he said. So many memories. You kept him alive in there. You never forgot. And I never will, she said, breaking down. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss here, but first, etymology corner, because doolally is such an interesting word, because I think that it has weirdly and circuitously arrived at a popular and immediate comprehensibility right here in 2025. Because if you showed it to a modern reader, a reader steeped in the pop culture that has embraced Delulu and all of its variants, I think that they would naturally draw a one-to-one connection between the two, and they would be pretty close as to the intended meaning. Doolally, though, is a much stranger word than it seems because it doesn't derive from delusional or delulu. It's attested from the 1910s in the name Deolali, a British army camp 100 miles northeast of Mumbai in India. It was a staging area, a holding area where soldiers who were returning home from India to Britain, and this, of course, we should say, is right in the middle of the British Raj, right in the middle of the British rule of India. The soldiers would go to Deolali where they would wait and wait and wait. And many were informally diagnosed with Deolali fever, or in the Urdu, Deolali tap, a kind of cabin fever manifesting in eccentricity and insanity, right? Deolali tap then becomes this shorthand for losing one's faculties, and by the middle of the 20th century had been contracted to simply Doolally. So Doolally and Delulu are effectively false cognates. They are words which appear to share the same linguistic root and meaning, but are actually derived from very different roots, right? Latin, attested in the 16th century in the case of delusional. Urdu, attested from the 20th century in the case of Doolally, and the K-pop fandom, attested from the 21st century in the case of Delulu. That isn't perhaps the most important thing about the passage, but, words are fun. Hugh is asking here in the chat, when she remembers Billy on a daily basis, is it when he was young, or were the best years when he was young, so she focuses on those? This is such an interesting question, Hugh, and I think that it is impossible to answer because of the process here, right? The order of events here. Muriel remembers Billy the way that Muriel remembers Billy. Avalon recreates Billy from Muriel's memories. Thus, Billy appears perfect in Muriel's memory because he is definitionally the way that she remembers him. So I don't know if we can really unpick this in terms of how she thinks of him. I'm particularly thinking of that passage there where she's looking for imperfection. And of course, she's not looking for imperfection because if there were an imperfection, she would not remember it, right? This is the perfect recreation of Billy. Now, does this look exactly like Billy if we compared him to a photograph in his, somewhat younger days? Probably not. I don't think that anyone's memory is that accurate, is that sufficient, right? He is probably this gestalt memory of 50 different Billies that she experienced over the course of the years, or within the, let's say, 10-year passage that his physical body represents at this point. But it is an interesting question to try to consider how Avalon is representing Billy here. I don't mean the physical mechanism of manifestation here, right? Avalon can change shape. Sure, I'll give that supernatural credit to the book. Fine, I absolutely accept that. But there is an interesting duality within the being of Avalon, within the physical body of Avalon, because Avalon is one thing, and we understand that to be true, and Billy is another, and we understand that to be true. And the fact that they occupy the same physical being here, right, in substance, if not in presentation, doesn't mean that their identity collapses into one single individual, at least as far as Muriel is concerned. She is aware of the distinction between the creature that appears in the image of her husband and her husband that is appearing here before her. She can sense that distinction, but hold both to be true at the same time. And the problem with that, fascinatingly, is that one of those things just isn't real, right? There is no Billy here. There is only Avalon in the image of Billy. But because he is drawn so fully from her memories, she is able to recognize him in a strange way. There's almost it's almost a ship of Theseus argument here, right? Like if Billy has been stripped of everything that makes him Billy and that thing has been recreated in the physical form of Avalon, is there a sense in which this thing in front of Muriel right now is Billy? And Muriel's clear answer is yes. There is a degree to which she is responding to him emotionally, intuitively, physically. There is something there. Moving on, because time is already running a little short. I love the very brief beat that we get in which Avalon insists that he is a sea creature rather than a sea monster, because sea monster implies that he is evil, which is just great. And then we close out the chapter. Oh, and then I pulled a slide to indicate, as Muriel she fetches Billy's clothes for Avalon, and then we get this really, really interesting maneuver right out of Stephen King, in fact. Here we go. "The bedroom is the first door on the left," he finished. "I know." She smiled. It was funny how quickly she accepted it. She put it down to her age. Muriel had seen a lot of weird and unexplained events throughout her life. Witch Haven and the surrounding areas had always been like that. There was just something in the air. From the mundane, drops in temperature and doors opening by themselves, to the inexplicable, like the bizarre fate that befell nearby Auchinmullen. Muriel shivered at the thought. There was more to this world than people knew. A lot more. While Avalon dressed, Muriel busied herself by fetching her mop and bucket and soaking up the worst of the blood. There wasn't much she could do about the ceiling and the walls. Not right now, anyway. She glanced at the mantel clock. It was almost 4 a.m. She hadn't been up this late since the 1960s, probably. Auchinmullen has already been mentioned before, back at the beginning of the book, as the place where Muriel and Billy went on their honeymoon, and this is the only other reference. But the framing here is sufficient that I am sure that you will not be surprised to learn that A, Auchinmullen is fictional, and B, it is the setting for Sodergren's 2020 novel Maggie's Grave, which is apparently, and I can't spoil what I haven't read, I guess, it is apparently a witch story. Having not read his other books, I don't know how thoroughly he's establishing this vision of a Scotland that is loaded like Stephen King's Maine is loaded with Derry and Castle Rock and Haven and Chester's Mill and so forth, or for that matter, H.P. Lovecraft's New England. But the narrative positioning of Witch Haven as a place where weird things happen in a world where weird things happen is a brilliant one. It is the kind of thing that I really love, particularly here, almost halfway into the book, right? Calling back, you establish this as a place early on, and I realized reading, I guess back in, chapter 3, I realized that Auchinmullen isn't, well, okay, I'm going to take a brief pause here to digress just a moment, because there are a few things in this book that are a little odd. And I need to look into David Sodergren's private life, I guess. I need to go and find some biographical information. I need to find out exactly what is going on here, because there are things in this book that don't quite hang together in terms of its authentic Scottishness. I'm particularly thinking of the wee thugs, the wee bastards going to Arthur's house, loaded with cans of gasoline. A word that no Scottish person would use, a word that I still struggle to use after 15 years of being in this country. That's petrol. You're talking about petrol there, right? And there are odd little... Auchinmullen is not quite perfectly formed as a fictional Scots name. I'm not sure that the Mullen, M-U-L-L-A-N ending is appropriate or is consistent, right? Auchin is fairly common, certainly in that part of the world. But there are odd things here that don't quite ring true, and I'm very curious the degree to which Sodergren is emulating an authentic voice, right? I know that he lives in Scotland. I know that he has personal experience of this area, right? You wouldn't be writing about the Trump organization in Balmedia if you didn't have personal experience of this area, I guess. But there's a quality here of some of the language being softened, some of the language being altered, some of the language being opened up in a way that is, I would guess, a deliberate attempt to make the book more accessible to American readers in particular, right? There are some Americanisms that find their way in here. Arthur's accent as well, not to speak ill of the dead here, so recently dead, but Arthur's accent softens a great deal as we move into the book. It's established pretty strong first off, but then we kind of really take the edges off of it a little bit. It becomes a little bit more anonymous, and that's okay. Like, I think that's a thing that you can do, but there are some unsolved mysteries here for me in the heart of the book, but I just had to pull that because anytime we get a horror author in particular taking the Stephen King road and building out this geography, I love it. So this is just another incitement, an inducement for me personally to go and read more of Sodergren's work, which I think I'm definitely going to be doing more actually on other texts later in tonight's show, because the poll for our next unit will be available around the time that this live broadcast ends. So we'll circle back to that in just a few short minutes. Here I am running out of time already. So we get the sequence where Muriel and Avalon go for a walk on the beach and they talk, and we address this idea more directly of memory. Let's take a look at this slide. Avalon looked at her. "I'm sorry. It's been a long time since I spoke with someone on land. The etiquette has altered considerably since my last visit." "Aye," said Muriel. And that was something Avalon couldn't replicate, the way Billy spoke. He had the voice and the mannerisms and even some of the right inflections, but the vocabulary was all wrong. Billy was a working-class man with language so salty you could sprinkle it in a plate of chips. "How much of him is in there?" she asked. "How much of you is my Billy?" "As much as you wish to believe." She turned to him and looked deeply into his eyes. It's frightening. It almost seems real. Are memories real? Of course, she said. Then so am I. And of course, the implicit question that we're dodging here is a complicated one, right? Because even if we take this at face values, are memories real? Yes. Cool. What do we mean by real? What do we mean by memory, right? This is the deep water. We are out here way, way past our depth. We have swum out past the buoys. We are out where there are riptides and dangerous things that could drag us beneath the surface. Which is not to say that it isn't completely fascinating, right? And I really did pull like 2 other slides just looking at Avalon and his history and looking at the way that he is presented as this fascinating immortal figure, right, who lives on geological kind of time frames and has visited here before the age of man. Everything has changed so fully, so completely, which is, again, not just a brilliant bit of world building, not just a brilliant conceit for a monster, right? Not just this Lovecraftian scale that dizzies us, that pushes back against us just a little, but also a really great interrogation of temporality. Because it's all the more interesting. It would be fine if Muriel was, in her 40s, or I guess it would be, the book would be much less good if Muriel was in her 20s, honestly. But, if Muriel were a younger person, this would still be great world building, but it's all the more urgent and important because Muriel here is so old, because our main cast is so aged, because we're thinking about mortality and we're thinking about the clock running out. And here is a creature who, by all accounts, is infinite, who has no clock. And that is another way in which we can look at what the body and physicality and identity really mean, right? We think of identity and physicality as being innately and inexorably tied to this ticking clock of biology, this ticking clock of mortality. And here is Avalon, who is presenting a very different kind of physicality, and also, an identity that is freed from the bounds and rigors of time. Hugh is asking in the chat, are memories what makes a person? And Hugh, you are on really solid, philosophical ground with that. I think that there is a strong argument that we are the collected superstructure of all of those moments of impression and moments of recollection that make us up, that constitute us. I think that in the absence of a clearly divine or supernatural soul, if you are unwilling to credit, an ineffable spark, the flame imperishable within the heart or mind of every living person, if you don't want to necessarily commit to the idea of that magical element that makes us who we are, right, of the soul, of the spirit, the kind of mechanistic approach to that is that we are an emergent property of a complex system, that we are a biological machine that has grown in sophistication to the point where it can apprehend itself, where it can both think and think about thinking at the same time, and that is what consciousness is. And if that is what consciousness is, then it can only exist in a fleeting fragment of time unless it is backed and bounded by memory. How do we know who we are? How do we know what has been? How do we know, how can we infer what will come next? How can we build the patterns that are so important to human psychology? Through the application of memory. I think there's a very powerful argument that if you alter someone's memory, you are, in a very real sense, killing the person that was, or deleting the person that was, and creating a new person. There are very complicated studies of memory in a psychological context, in a neurophysical context, for sure. But also, of course, this is a well that has been well drained by our desire for narratives about memory and identity. It's a common trope to go to the you bang your head and now you're a different person, and then you bang your head again and you're the person that you were before, and that these personalities are understood even in the popular consciousness to be emergent properties of memory and of being. And if that is true, right? This is, I think, what Sodergren is prompting us to ask here. If that is true, and Billy, not to slip into an argument about solipsism and about personal identity as it interacts with the world, right? Not to suggest that there is a cave wall with shadows upon it, or a demon who is lying to you, but if Muriel's interaction with Billy is only ever Muriel's apprehension of Billy, right? We can never genuinely know what another person is. We can only ever gather our sense impression, our understanding of that person. And if that is what Avalon is drawing on to create this simulacrum of Billy, then that simulacrum of Billy would be indistinguishable from Muriel's memory of Billy. And if that simulacrum of Billy is indistinguishable from Muriel's recollection of Billy, then is it not, in a sense, exactly the same? Is this not Billy that is standing in front of her? Except to the degree to which Avalon is imprinting his own personality on this moment, right? This nebulous thing that was just in the slide there, I guess in the slide that we were just discussing, this idea that Avalon is replicating the manner of speech that Billy possessed, but he's not using the same vocabulary. He's not drawing from the same kind of linguistic basket that Billy had. Is that something that he is choosing to do? Is that something that is necessary, that is inevitable? Is that a limit to Muriel's memory and imagination here? Or could he perfectly replicate Billy had he the mind to? This is going to be very important at the end of the book, right? If you've already read ahead to our stark conclusion, then you'll know where we're going with that. But otherwise, we'll talk about it next week. But we're going to be able to talk about exactly how this process works in more detail as we move forward. Okay, let's move into the last little part of tonight's show. Do I have one more slide left? I do. I have one more real slide and then a couple of things just for fun to wrap it all up here at the end. We get in this moment, right, having overextended himself, and I was mentioning earlier, right, these ideas of sublime transgressive violence, and here we get another one, albeit one of a different sort, because this is this moment of the loss of cohesion for Avalon, this horrifying disintegration of the bodily form. As we return back to the cottage, we fall into the bathtub. Muriel sustains him with the mop water containing the blood of Tommy, right, which leads her to this realization that if she wants her husband back, she's going to have to, feed Avalon. There's going to have to be like a quid pro quo here. But, there are evil people in the world. Let's get to that. Let's get to that next slide. There was no point thinking about it. The very notion was sick. She couldn't do it. And even if she did, what then? How many meals would it take? How many lives? No, she promised herself she wouldn't even consider it. It wasn't an option. The boy who had died, he was a bad person, a killer. It was justified. There are a lot of bad people in the world. A car horn beeped outside. The taxi. Arthur's funeral was taking place in the nearby town of Muir, as Witchhaven Cemetery was no more, the bodies having been dug up and transported elsewhere to make way for Grant's golf course. A block of portable toilets for the workers now marked the spot where the old chapel, where she and Billy had exchanged vows, once stood. Muriel tugged her sleeves down, said goodbye to Avalon, and left. Of course, if we're talking about the desecration of the landscape by this Trumpian figure, right, by Patrick Grant coming in to build his golf course. And we're talking about the importance of bodies too, right, in motion and at rest. There is nothing more stark. There is nothing more vulgar than the uprooting of the cemetery. The chapel too, right? But we're not really that interested in ideas of God and prayer here, right? This notion of religion is largely absent from the text. But the bodies, that is much more important. The memories too, right? This kind of implicit connection, this fundamental connection between body and memory that we would find in any graveyard there. So really lovely, but harrowing nonetheless. And as we say, Elizabeth's calling out very Audrey 2 here in the chat. Yeah, not unlike Audrey 2. Yeah, do I like the Haar better than I like Little Shop of Horrors? Yes, probably. I still think that I am waiting to see the definitive live. I've never seen Little Shop of Horrors live on stage. I've only ever seen, I think I did see like a Bowdlerized high school version years ago back in Scotland. But I have, of course, seen the movie version, which maybe I was just too young, but it left a very sour impression for me. And I've tried revisiting it, and that sour impression has not abated. So maybe, here are the two options. I either need to go and see a really fantastic live performance of Little Shop of Horrors, or I need them to remake it. One of those two things. And I don't even know if that's a controversial statement. I don't even know if inviting the idea of a musical remake is scandalous with regard to Little Shop. But you know what? West Side Story turned out pretty good, actually. So maybe that's a thing that we could start doing. Anyway, we attend Arthur's funeral and we learned that Terry is also now, the other member of the Rebel Alliance is also now giving up, accepting the much smaller offer that Grant's people are now making, which is, indignity stacked on indignity to have cut the offer from £200,000 now down to £50,000 because they know that they are going to win. And even in the midst of their incalculable wealth, they cannot do this kindness. They cannot just give what was first offered. Every indignity that can be visited upon these people as a punishment for standing up to Grant in the first place is going to be levied against them. Feels very familiar at this point. Muriel then returns home and considers for a moment like how easy it would be to DoorDash a snack for Avalon in the form of Grant's representatives. Another little foreshadowing beat that we get here, right? It's kind of introducing the idea so that we can revisit it more fully later. And that is when the two men show up and we get the extended scene of Muriel satisfying their desire to stage a suicide. This is harrowing. I found this extremely difficult to read for all that these two guys are too dopey, I think, to be taken completely seriously. I'm not sure that they absolutely work for me, these American thugs, not like the local hires who left such a mess behind. These guys are more clean, more polished, more capable, except absolutely not actually capable or professional. They then begin, this is Aaron and Kevin to borrow, like, brilliant use of American names. They begin to clean up the scene, believing Muriel to be dead, all a part of her ploy, of course. We get this brief reference to the long-standing prank that the Scots like to play on tourists of every stripe, particularly American tourists, that there are wee bagpipe-shaped creatures out there in the Highlands who live on the mountainsides. That's why the legs on the one side are shorter than the legs on the other side, so they can scurry more effortlessly around like the curvature of the mountain. This is the story that we tell tourists about haggises, I guess, and it's a weird inclusion here, honestly. But I'm going to call up a slide here just to show you. This is what I take to be AI slop produced by the Haggis Wildlife Foundation, a satirical cryptozoological website. But the idea of there being wee haggises out there in the wilds is very common and is still replicated even today. If you go into a pub, if you are of a gullible touristy affect, you can go into a pub in the Highlands and someone there will show you an old scar, doubtless gained from a tractor or from a car crash or from something much more mundane, and credit it to a fierce wee haggis up there on the mountainside. What's so interesting about this actually is that the rise of this particular urban myth, if that is indeed what it is, that this cryptozoological explanation for the existence of haggis, has its roots here in America, here in the United States, specifically in a poem written by satirist James J. Montague in the New York Tribune in 1924, which I'm going to call up right here. My heart's in the Highlands, twa strings on my bow, to hunt the fierce haggis, man's awfullest foe. And will my bairn hae a tear in his ee, for I shallna come back if the haggis hunts me. It's maybe not the greatest poem I've ever put on a slide, honestly, but, here we are. It's a really great evocation of that kind of, flamboyant, shortbread tin kind of vision of Scotland. In any case, here we are basically at the end of tonight's show because I have to prompt the poll for next week. So Avalon kills and consumes the intruders. And on the brink of chapter 18 is where we will call it for tonight. Next week, we will finish up the rest of the Haar. And then, well, that's the question, isn't it? Because in about 4 or 5 minutes, as of this live recording, we are going to see a poll go live over on the Next Word Patreon page. That's patreon.com/nextword. If you support Next Word to the tune of a couple of dollars a month, then you'll get access to that poll and you will be able to choose from 4 fine options for our back-to-back horror session, I guess, right? Having just completed this unit on modern horror, we might just go right into another unit on modern horror or classic horror. I have picked 4 fairly different books that I had to do pretty quickly. This is for even better, right? Not only is this next unit going to carry us all the way the 3 remaining weeks after we're done with the Haar to the end of October, but it is also brilliantly our super spooky 13th unit So we are going to choose between, you are going to choose between, I have no vote, I have no say in this. You are going to choose between The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson from 1959, which was on the list last year. It was pipped to the post by Bram Stoker's Dracula. It is a fantastic book. It has one of the best first pages in literary history. It is the essential haunted house novel. It is just so good. I cannot wait to talk about that. We will, I promise, someday talk about that, even if it doesn't make the cut this time, because it's up against a lesser known author. In 1979, the author Richard Bachman released a book called The Long Walk, which has just weirdly been turned into a very big budget and quite critically well received movie. That is, of course, because Richard Bachman is, spoilers, really Stephen King. And The Long Walk is a fascinating examination of the ways in which dystopia can dehumanize us, the ways in which we are distracted by bread and circuses, the ways in which the human body fails in its mechanical impulse when driven to the direst exigency, and the connection between body and mind. I'm really interested to look at The Long Walk. For all we mentioned in last week's reading, I think that I want to talk about King at some point, and The Long Walk is a short book, and the movie just came out, so it seems like a perfect confluence. If you're interested in talking about Stephen King, if you're interested in talking about this metaphor for the brutality of man against man, and for the brutality of Stephen King, right? So is this a JFK book or is this a Vietnam book? And the answer is this is a Vietnam book. So we're going to be talking about that too, of course. That's The Long Walk, ostensibly by Richard Bachman. The third option on that poll is I'm Thinking of Ending Things, the 2016 debut novel from Ian Reid, the Canadian author. Reid manages to pack more characterization, more voice into a page than many people can pack into an entire novella. It's real voicey. It's very strong. It does hook on, it pivots on a twist. So it does make it spoilerable in a way that I don't think any of the books that we've discussed thus far have been spoilerable. Maybe don't, if you're interested in reading I'm Thinking of Ending Things and you haven't yet, maybe don't go looking for, too much information about it, because you wouldn't want to tip your hand too early. It's not to suggest that, once you spoil a book that you can't return to it. It's just to suggest that the pivot when it comes is really quite good. And I would hate for you to not have that experience. So that's maybe a blind shot in the dark for many of you if you haven't read I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid from 2016. And then the last one, also adapted into a recent movie, as I'm Thinking of Ending Things was, as The Long Walk was. And of course, we've had adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House too. Also, we have The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul G. Tremblay from 2018. This highest concept pressure cooker of a novel. He's an enormously dexterous writer. He manages to do a lot with a single word, which is the efficiency and the lightness of touch in his prose and in his characterization is, I think, really wonderful to behold, to enjoy. That is adapted into the novel A Knock at the Cabin. Is it called A Knock at the Cabin by M. Night Shyamalan from a couple of years ago? Jonathan Groff, Dave Bautista et al. So that's also a really interesting one with a really interesting adaptation too. If we pick any of these, I think we'll probably do like either 2 weeks on the text and then a bonus episode right before Halloween looking at the movie adaptation, or the movie adaptation will obviously become the bonus episode that we can talk about. It's going to be a ton of fun. All of those are great options. Like I don't think there's a dead one in the basket there. So I'm really hoping that you guys will cast your votes, that you will be merciful to me, and we'll have something lined up for an excellent 13th unit. We're then immediately going to, of course, launch into the 14th unit that is going to carry us through November and the first half of December. So we're going to be looking at like a 6-week unit. I, as of right now, have no ideas for that. That's not true. I mean, I have a list of like 40 ideas that we could do, but I haven't alighted on one yet. So if you have a particular desire, if you would really like to talk about a kind of novel, a kind of genre, a particular form that you're interested in, get in touch and let me know. We're going to be looking at a book from, as I say, the first week of November through to the middle of December. And then we're going to be catching up with our tradition here, our third year covering a Lewis Narnia book at Christmas time. We're going to be looking at The Voyage of the Dawn Treader this year. So that's going to be a lot of fun too. And that is it. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Hugh, for joining me tonight. If you would like more from Next Word, patreon.com/nextword is absolutely the place to go. You can follow along there for free to get the links to these live sessions if you want to come out, hang out and be brilliant here on a Thursday evening, or you can pledge a few dollars a month there to help me, continue making podcasts, to upgrade my equipment, to buy more books. It's mostly to buy more books, if we're honest, if we're candid here. Then patreon.com/nextword. If you have a moment, please leave a rating, leave a review for the podcast, wherever you have listened to the podcast. Or, tell somebody, tell a friend, chat to your local barista in your local coffee shop. Go and, I don't know, I'm trying to pull something from the Haar now, and there's nothing. There are basically no... Find a sea monster and tell a sea monster about your favorite literary podcast, Stars and Swords. That is going to do it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care. Good night, all.